Hello and welcome everyone. In this video I'll show how I've made the Jurassic Raptor diorama. This video will be covering all steps to make this dense jungle terrain and also how I've repainted this raptor model. As the first step, I'll be using the slice of natural wood, which I picked up at a garden center. To make this appear a bit nicer, I will apply a wood stain over it. For maximum strength, I'll be using Rambo. This can be applied by using a brush, but I like to use a rag instead. I then cut out some shapes of this dense foam to make the basic groundwork. Here I'm using my hot wire cutting table, but it can also easily be done by using a knife. With all the foam parts cut out, I then began making some random shapes on them. I used a knife and a lighter for the edges and then made some areas of depth using this hobby blowtorch. When melting foam like this, always make sure you have good ventilation or use a respirator mask. Using PVA glue, I then attached the foam layers onto each other. To make the transition between the layers a bit more even, I'll be using this air drying modeling clay. I also applied some on the bottom of this raised area I've made. With the clay still soft, I added a few small stones and some coarse ballast by pressing them in. After letting the clay fully dry, I will then prime it using this primer. I usually like to add a drop of color to this, because I find it easier to paint things up from a tan color. When the primer had dried, I applied a layer of PVA glue and sprinkled some fine sand over it. As the next step, I'll make a mixture of this modeling paste, some acrylic paint and a few types of ballast and gravel. I applied this mainly on the sides and also underneath the raised area. Following up is some finer material for some more texture and to fill in any areas I may have missed. With the groundwork all textured up, I can now start painting it. I first apply a coat of black primer, followed up by a light dusting of white primer. I used grey-green as the overall base coat and then some olive drab to outline some shadows. To give the small stones some color, I base coated them and afterwards gave them a light dry brush using a lighter tone. With all the base coats applied, I will now put the terrain piece on hold for a while, in order to make all items required to turn this into a jungle. I'll be using these dried branches to make the first one. To make the basic armatures, I drill some holes in them in order to pin them together. To do this, I use paper clips and some superglue. As the next step, I filled in the gaps using acrylic wood filler. This is then followed by a layer of PVA glue and then some tile grout to create a bit of texture. To make a hollow dead tree for the terrain, I'm going to use these natural tree roots and combine them with one of my classics. Next, I will be combining these twigs with these small pine cones I found. With these, I'll try to replicate some of these elevated ferns you see in tropical forests often. I also assembled these by pinning them. For some added texture and to fill in the gaps, I applied some PVA glue and potting soil over it. When using potting soil, I would recommend drying and sterilizing it first. I covered this in detail in my forest ground cover video. Alongside these, I made one of my rainforest trees. For the basic armature, I'm going to refer to my tutorial on these, which also can be found on my channel. With the armatures assembled, I then gave them a coat of black primer, followed with a layer of white primer. The trees were then given a base coat of green-brown, and afterwards a few shadow colors. The pine cones on a stick were then given a dry brush of German beige. To give them a wash, I mixed a few artist oils with some white spirit. I gave them an overall wash using green umber and then added a darker tone to some of the recesses. When the wash had dried, I added a few spots of PVA glue and then added some moss over this in the form of finely grinded green herbs. will then be adding some lichen to the trees. I begin by making a mixture out of weathering pigments, matte varnish and water. Using this fine destrainer, I will create some random splatter effects. I'll be using my airbrush here, but it can also be done by going over it with a stiff brush. The next thing I'll be using are these fine dried plant roots. You can usually find this in bags of decorative moss. I make a mixture of brown wash and ink with some water, and then add some of this material to soak in it for a short while. This will soften them up to add them over the trees as hanging and creeping vines. It's a little fiddly at first, but once the acrylic medium from the wash dries, they will harden up. To give some color to these vines, I applied a few dots of PVA and then add some small ivy leaves here and there. For the foliage, I'll be using this preserved sea foam, which you can find at stores that sell model railroad supplies. I give them a layer of the same colors as I used on the trees earlier. When this was done, I add some full-strength PVA on top of them and then add some fine ground foam over it. After letting this dry, a layer of slightly diluted PVA follows and then some of these model leaves. To break up that green a bit, I added a little splash of bright green ink to them. With all the foliage done, it can now be glued onto the trees using PVA glue. I'll then start making several plants for the base. On the left here are some plastic plants, and on the middle and right lane are some natural plants that I preserved myself. You could use both, but for this video I will use the preserved natural ones. To do this, I'll start making a mixture to preserve them in. In this case, I've used 250 ml warm water and add some color to it using fabric dye and food coloring. Next, I'll add 125 ml glycerin to the mixture and give it a good stir. so the ratio is 2 parts water to 1 part glycerin. I selected a few plants I picked up at a garden center. After adding the plants, I covered them up and let them rest for 3 to 4 days to give them enough time to get fully saturated in this mixture. When done, I take them out and take some of the excess glycerin off using paper towels. This one I'm holding here is already around 10 months old, and although it's still durable, it has become discolored. The way to work around this is to paint them after preserving, which I will show shortly after. The first one I'll be using is this preserved asparagus fern. I clipped small segments of them and attached them using superglue. I gradually add more until they've become dense. To secure them a bit better, a drop of scenery glue is then added at the connection points. After preserving these plants in glycerin, the leaves have become a bit oily and slightly waxed. Because of this, a good way to paint them is to use a solvent-based paint as the first layer. You can paint them using acrylics and washes afterwards, but as your initial layer, I would recommend using a spray can. After having sprayed them with olive drab, I added some green and yellow ink to brighten them up. Next, I'll use this natural dried moss, from which I'll use the non-green bits found underneath. I'll use this to simulate the hanging dried out leaves on these plants. After adding them, I add a wash to finish them with. For the next one, I'll use this twig and drill out a few holes on the top. I'm then adding some of these preserved leaves, which are already given a coat of dark green spray paint. To provide some more texture to the trunk, I applied a layer of PVA glue and then add some coarse wood fiber and potting soil. I then added some of this fine material I used earlier underneath the leaves. And also wrapped some of this randomly around the trunk. Using some green ink, the leaves were then given a richer tone, followed by a brown wash on the trunk. I'll then be combining this preserved ivy with some of the stems left over from the sea foam I used for the foliage. I first make a small incision on the stems and then lock them into position by using this jungle booby trap technique. With the leaves attached, I then filled in the gaps and gave them some texture using PVA glue followed by potting soil. When the glue had dried, I added some acrylic ink to give them some color and painted the leaves the same way as the previous ones. Next, I added some weathering on the leaves using the same mixture I used for the lichen. I noticed these large leaves often show some holes in them. I try to replicate that by going over them at some random spots using a Dremel tool. With most of the trees and plants done, I can now return to the base. The sides and bottom of this terrain will get an exposed earth look to them. I'm adding these natural tree roots using a pin vise and some PVA glue. Since this is the bottom piece, I will finish and paint this now and apply the same techniques for the sides at a later stage. In order to paint this exposed ground, I will mix up several pigment washes by mixing dry pigment powders and water. I randomly splash this on and finish with an overall wash of brown ink. As the next step, I use some of the same mixture used for the sides earlier, consisting of modeling paste, sand and some acrylic paint. To give this some more texture, I'm adding some dried herbs and coarse wood fiber. This is then applied to some of the flat areas of the base, and afterwards the trees can be added. I planted this palm initially on this spot, but moved it one level higher at a later stage. As the next step, I take a portion of the plants I preserved, mainly using leftovers and the ones that were a bit less nice. Using a Ziploc bag, I lightly spray them using a brown color. I disassemble them into small bits to use on the forest floor. In order to make this, I use the same acrylic paste mixture as the previous layer, with the exception that this one is more diluted. I begin by applying a relative thick layer of this and then adding some pigment washes at random. While this is still wet, I will then add the leaves over this. combined with this moss, which has been soaked in brown wash, and some potting soil. I'm then just gonna toss it around and make a little decomposing salad out of this. When this was done, I added some of the pigment washes on the sides. To blend the colors on the sides, I added a wash using brown ink. To seal the ground cover a bit better, I'll be adding a layer of scenery glue. Both of these recipes will work for this and can be found on my channel. But for delicate things like this, I would encourage you to try the matte medium recipe. I added some of these cork bits on the sides to break things up. If you're looking to get one of these professional turntables, you may want to consider picking up this one. I added some spots of PVA glue on some of the exposed areas and apply a few of these moss pads over it. With these added, I will now add the tree log, followed by the other small trees and plants. Next, I added a few larger bits of the tree roots alongside this other type of ivy that I've preserved and painted. Using this dried moss, I will then make some tufts of grass. I give them some color using a mixture of acrylic ink, airbrush thinner and some water. These were then scattered around the base together with a couple more preserved plants. With the majority of the plants now added, I then combined the two bases using PVA glue. To prevent any possible balancing issues, I added a few of these felt pads underneath. It also presents itself a bit better if it's slightly raised. To break up all that green on the base, I've selected a few types of dried flowers. I gather a few pieces and freshen them up using some bright acrylic colors. A good source to find these flower bundles will be florists or garden centers. As the final bits of vegetation, I'll be using this dried grass, which I found outside. I give them a wash and then apply them to the base. With all the trees and vegetation on the base, it's now time to provide them with some water. I'll be using 2-part epoxy resin to do this. I measure equal parts and stir it until it becomes clear. To add some color to this, I add a drop of acrylic paint. If I was to spill this resin onto the wooden base, it would be very difficult to correct this. So as a precaution, I've added an upside down shower cap over it. These come in handy sometimes with terrain builds. They're cheap and reusable. I've added the resin to simulate some rainwater. With the base now nearly finished, I will now turn to painting the model I selected for this diorama. I'll be using this Velociraptor model, which is based on the ones from the Jurassic Park movie series. It already came painted a bit greenish, but I decided to give it a repaint. I already removed the mold lines, filled in the seams and gave it a coat of white primer. I begin by pre-shading some areas using a mix of mahogany and black. The base coat is then applied using sand yellow. When this was done, I added some white on the lower parts, followed by green-brown on the middle. Using German grey, I then made the markings. This was followed by applying Beastie Brown on top of this, which is an orange-brown tone. The talons were then given a coat of grey-green. I then painted the eyes using duck egg green and black. As the next step, I will be using some watercolors. I'm combining a few of them with water to create a dark red tone. I'll be using this as a light glaze on some of the colors. After having applied some of this, I use a damp brush to soften the edges a little. I also mixed a few darker tones to outline some of the details and make the markings a bit richer. With all the colors applied, I then give it a light wash using brown ink. To seal in the colors and protect the model, I gave it a coat of satin varnish. I then added the model onto the base. Before calling this diorama finished, there's one more ingredient I wanted to add to this. What I'll be using here is natural amber. You can find this at art supply stores. Just like mentioned in the movie, it's fossilized tree sap. There's a lot of interesting facts about this, and unless my sources were wrong, it's usually millions of years old. It is not uncommon to find little organic things that have become stuck in it, like on this piece here. I'm not sure what it is, because I haven't extracted its DNA yet, but my guess is that it's a bit of plant material. I've added a few small chunks of this in the exposed ground around the base. So with the addition of this, in a small way, it now has a truly prehistoric element to it. With this, we've reached the end of this video. I really hope you've enjoyed watching it and to see you in the next one. Until then, thank you for watching and take care.
Work complete.